Welcome to the 96th episode of the New Ventures podcast. I'm your host, Sanjoy Sanyal, the founder of Regain Paradise, a boutique climate finance firm and a visiting fellow at the Cambridge Judge Business School. I'm doing this series of podcasts to understand the links between climate change and food security. And today we have a returning guest. Welcome back, Menezes.
Thank you, Sanjoy. It's really good to be here again, 3 years after I had our last episode. So very nice to see you and very happy to be here with you once again.
Yes, 3 years. You were actually on the 25th podcast, and today we are on the 96th. So in some ways, life has moved. And how has life been in the last 3 years?
Oh, so much has happened. If you recall, back in 2022, which I'm sure we discussed a lot during the episode, we were in the middle of the journey of scaling up my venture, Tindo. We started that company back in Singapore in 2020. 2021, we were basically doing some MVP, launching in smaller markets such as Singapore, Hong Kong, Dubai. In 2022, when we had our chat, we were just touching on the US. Back then, I had just moved into Chicago, and I was really building up distribution, hiring local teams, setting up R&D center, production capacity in North America. And it was just the beginning of that journey. After that, you can imagine how much has happened, right? I mean, we were able to scale up in the US. Right after our chat, we were also able to launch in the UK and in Germany. And the journey from there was outstanding. I'm pretty sure Tindo, out of the companies that were launched about the same time in 2020, was the fastest growing company of its sector globally. And it was an incredible and hectic journey. So since our last chat in 2022, we were able to grow in the US as planned, and then in Germany, the UK. And then last year, I left the company, and right now I'm talking to you from Brazil. We had our baby boy here in Brazil last year, and life has changed significantly since then.
Congratulations on the baby boy, and of course, on helping your company grow up into adolescence as well. This is fantastic. Because it's a food security topic, we'll have to ask you, you were in Singapore for many years, and then you traveled a lot, and then you got back to Brazil. How was the typical lunch changed during these years?
Sanjoy, that's a very interesting question about the lunch, right? How has it changed over time? Just to recap, I was in Singapore for 6 years and then in Chicago for 2, Europe for another 2. Each country obviously carried their own cuisine and cities, but cities globally, they have a more common background of international cuisine. That's true. That said, what I miss are those local dishes and experiences. And I would say number one of all, what I miss the most is what I used to have very frequently in Singapore, the street food from Singapore, the hawker food, the hawker centers. In fact, I'm going to be in Singapore later in May, and I can't wait to just go around and explore again and eat as much as I can on the hawker food in Singapore.
I'll look forward to your LinkedIn post and see, from which hawker center, what dish you'll be posting. We'll move on to work from lunch. And Andre, now you're involved with multiple companies, right?
Yes, Sanjoy. I'm involved with multiple companies right now. And you know what happened? During the time I had as a founder building a company, I realized how challenging and also how lonely it is as a founder for you to build and juggle multiple pressures. Obviously, the challenge itself of building a business, but also being that solid base for your team to thrive. And also dealing with all the expectations from stakeholders and shareholders. It is a lonely journey. So what I've done is that I decided to use my learnings to support other founders in their journeys. That's why I'm involved with multiple companies right now. I'm involved with 3 companies, and my goal is really to support the founders and that the businesses thrive through the times that they're going through, whichever challenge it is that they have right now.
Absolutely. It's a lonely journey. And, having somebody like you is going to be great. But I'm dying to know about the 3 companies.
I will start from my order of involvement when I started involved somehow with them. The first one, Confetti Snacks, it's a Singaporean company which I came to know back in 2021, 2022. Both myself and Betty, the founder of Confetti, we were in our journey of growing our businesses in Chicago, and we would exchange a lot of learnings and challenges and issues we would have. And I decided to join as a small investor back then in 2022. To the extent I had any availability, we always kept in touch as founder to founder help and support. After I left Tindo, then I offered to Betty that I could help her closer because I had more time availability if she felt that was helpful. And it was. It's just been a year now since I've been working closely with her, trying to support the company, which obviously as a shareholder, I'm also incentivized to do so, to try to help her overcoming the challenges that every company, every founder goes through, plus obviously the company. And that company is upcycling veggies into delicious gourmet snacks that you can find on shelves. Usually the snacks market, the snack aisle, if you recall, it's mostly made of potato and corn starch products. Confetti has developed a few products that are using real, actual veggies to do delicious, really incredibly craveable snacks. So that's number one. Singapore company, main market happens to be the US. Number two, company of a friend of mine. We studied together engineering, and in Brazil, he reached out for help. He was going through some business challenges and he reached out for help. And again, I decided to invest a little bit personally and also to help him closer. We've been for about a year as well, working closely together. And I'm seeing that company progress. They do in Brazil, everywhere you go, you can find obviously French fries as a side dish. But in Brazil, there's also another one made with tapioca or yuca, depending on how you call it, depending where you live. And that's very popular in Brazil. They have made one very convenient, delicious product that is just like a French fry in terms of occasion that you would have as a side dish to protein or as a snack. And they're scaling that up. So the company has doubled its revenue over the last 12 months. It's growing well, obviously going through the challenges as any early stage companies do, but it's been a very fulfilling journey. They're more like frozen products growing in Brazil, produced not so far from where I am right now. A third one is a very interesting one called Selva. Selva originally started as a cell culture meat fat company, but they have recently pivoted into using their scientific knowledge and background, which is around encapsulation, to do ingredients that are already commercially viable, ready to scale, and that would improve now the outcomes that the food industry and nutraceutical industry are looking for. That has been a fascinating journey as well. It's more recent. I joined them as an advisor about 2 months ago. And I'm learning so much and having a lot of fun learning about that sector. And I see a lot of potential there.
We'll get into each of these companies in detail because I think they're all very interesting. But the upcycled vegetable food, that has so much climate impact in terms of, just reducing wastage. And the tapioca companies, I suppose, is local ingredients helping farmers as well as reducing imports. I think interesting. And I think this cellular agriculture, I'm really dying to know about that because I did several podcasts last year on this new food, not plant-based food like you did in Tyndall, but the cellular agriculture and precision fermentation. And I realized, and I'm going to understand your views on this, many of these companies are actually very far away from commercial production, and how this company is pivoting will be very interesting to know. But before I do all that, I want to ask you a really personal question. And that is, when you work with these founders, you are not doing what you did last time. So like, I'm going to use a Brazilian football example. You're not going out in the field kicking the ball. You're kind of standing at the sidelines. Is that you're a coach in some ways, I guess? Is that a difficult transition? How do you manage that?
That's a very interesting question, Sanjoy. It is definitely a relevant point. But at the same time, I don't see the fact that I was a founder and an executive before as an issue in terms of myself having to get used to it. It's almost quite the opposite. It's because right now, if I wanted to be a founder again, I would be a founder again right now, right? If I wanted to be running something full time, involved in operating on the playing on the fields, that's what I would be doing. And right now it happens, I decided that at the current stage, and this may change, but at the current state of my life, that playing from the sidelines is actually a better fit. And it's not the same, indeed. I love being on the field. I love constructing. I love building, together with the teams. And the brilliant thing is that these founders, they do, I come very much closer than an advisor or just a coach would get to that. But
I'm not operating full day every day, right? So I think that the interesting thing here is that as a founder, I put myself on their shoes and say, what is it that I would like help with coming from someone like me? Because the world is full of people who would come and tell you what you should do, what you shouldn't do, and whatnot. And that's not what I'm here to do. It's like, I mean, I'm really there to understand the pains they're going through and help them whichever way is helpful to go through them. Sometimes I'll get more involved, sometimes I'll get less, sometimes I'll try to help really solving a problem with them. Sometimes I'll get as hands-on as you can possibly get. Like I was in Los Angeles with confetti on a trade show, handing out samples and building up the booth, and it was super cool. So this is, for me, this is exactly where I want to be and what I want to do right now. And the fact that I was a founder and executive before just helps me understanding what I can really help with versus and what the founder's probably expecting from me versus if I hadn't been one.
What I'm hearing from you is flexibility, putting yourself in the founder's shoes and asking at that point, what is it that they need? Being able to play, sometimes you are on maybe regular calls of once a week, sometimes once a quarter, but sometimes you are actually getting out there and meeting customers like the way you did in the US. Just again to take the football example, bit like my favorite Brazilian player, Roberto Carlos. He played at the back, the center, took the ball forward. He scored goals, he did free kicks, he did everything. So a bit like that, maybe.
Yeah, in a way, this is coming from the fact that I have been through a journey in which, as a founder, you're not specializing in one thing. When you're building a company, as a founder, as I built from zero, I needed to be the supply chain guy and the finance guy, the sales guy, the marketing guy, and all of it together with the team, obviously, right? As we grew, we were hiring people. But unlike a corporation, there's no way you can let other people do the job. Sometimes it's fundraising, sometimes it's managing and the board, sometimes it's setting up a production facility, being in a trade show. And I've done all of that. So my experience in the end, I've been through all of those shoes. And whenever, as you said, whatever is needed at a time, I'm flexible to adapt. And the good thing is that I enjoy pretty much all of those points and touch points and areas. So yeah, for me, it's just fun.
So now we are ready to get into the podcast as it is, and to understand the climate change impacts of these businesses and the challenges they face. We'll start with Confetti Snacks because that's also the company that you got involved with first, and also from Singapore. Upcycled vegetables, right? And upcycled snacks. That's a huge climate impact there, right? Tell us where does it source its inputs? And then you said that essentially it's an export market. How does it export? What type of restrictions they had to manage, and so on and so forth?
Well, you know what's interesting? Just coming back a little bit before even this next upcycling. Many times we talk about upcycling, and we tend to believe that this is this novel thing, that's very hard to commercialize, and maybe people we will not like. But we forget that if you are part of the meat industry, if you've been part of the meat industry, you would know that upcycling is a reality, and it's without upcycling, the meat industry wouldn't exist. And I'll give you the biggest and most visible example of them all. It's called chicken nuggets, right? Chicken nuggets it's an upcycled, it's a product made with upcycled parts of chicken, which you did not want to throw away because they are delicious and valuable and all that, but also costly, right? You raise a chicken for so much, you have the animal, and I think even from an ethics perspective, you should try to, if you're slaughtering an animal, you should not waste anything out of it, right? And the chicken nuggets is one example of upcycled food that's everywhere in every single country, and people would eat it, right? So I like to start from that framing because, and likewise, there is no part of an animal in the meat industry that's not simply thrown away, really. Something will be done out of it, sometimes higher value, sometimes lower value, but there's no part that's thrown away. Likewise, we don't like to think of that industry as upcycling as well, but the oil industry, in a way, there's an upcycle element as well, because if you're trying to get diesel or gasoline out of oil, you get a bunch of other ingredients as well, right? So you try to use them all and produce things out of them. A bit less obvious than the nuggets example I had, but I think it's important just to frame it as such, just demystifies a bit what upcycle really is. Similarly with confetti, if you think about veggies and mushrooms and all, if you have those products, perfect products that are nutritious and healthy and great to be had, nutritionally speaking, but somehow maybe the mushroom bottom is missing. Maybe, the carrot's slightly tilted to one side. It doesn't matter. They may not make into the supermarket shelf, right? And then you have two problems. One, they may have less demand and they will simply expire, or they may not be wanted at all and they'll be really dumped. So that's absurd. And it's a very high portion. Some estimates about 30% of the veggies in the world may be thrown away or may actually be wasted in different parts of the value chain. Confetti comes in a part of that chain to try to solve the problem right at the source. Whatever products that are delicious, nutritious, fresh, and great for consumers could be transformed into gourmet snacks, perfectly sliced snacks like sliced carrots or mushroom buttons that are absolutely perfect, but they would probably have been thrown away if they were not processed into making those snacks. Needless to say, there's a massive impact on that. And, confetti right now, of course, the company is born out of Singapore, but the main market is in the US. It's still exported out of Asia to the US, but it's always looking into ways of localizing its chains to get the local ingredients close to the source and to the destination.
It's great. The ugly vegetables, the misshapen vegetables to be converted into some gourmet snacks. Does confetti get its produce from the retailers in Singapore? Because Singapore doesn't produce carrots, it imports them. Explain, where does the sourcing of these vegetables come?
No, it's not produced in Singapore. Right now, the product comes from Malaysia into the US mostly, right? Not only the US, but the production happens in Malaysia.
So the grower in Malaysia gives it to confetti, or the retailer says, okay, no.
It's not coming from retailers. Confetti sources its ingredients directly from, it's not that it goes to retailers and out. So the way it all works with retailers is upon reaching a shelf life issue, you would not be able to utilize anymore for food safety reasons. That's part of why food waste is so complicated as well. But as an industry, you have to take it before it goes to the shelf, right? So it's before it goes to retailers. And that's the case for confetti or for anyone else. Like, you cannot go into the shelf and then take it out and process it again. That's not what happens. What happens is straight, the growers would supply products that would not go into retail. And then because of the shape, because of whatever formats, and then from there, confetti would do this next.
Wonderful. And then it, manufactured in Malaysia and then export to the United States. Does snacks like these have to go through international markets? Is not easy, right? What type of tests and certifications does it have to go through from a food safety standpoint?
Yeah, vegetables, they're two pretty big categories if I simplify and oversimplify without trying to be extremely precise, technically speaking. But of course, you have novel foods that are not yet approved to be sold in a certain country. That's one end. And then you would need to go, like you may have seen many times, the cell culture companies going through grass and this and that to get FDA to even allow them to have consumption of that element into the country. Of course, that's not the case with confetti. Confetti is just selling vegetables, right? And then you have number two, foods such as meat, which obviously I'm very familiar with after 10 years working in the meat industry. Meat is highly regulated. So every destination and source would have a health certificate. That plant, that country, that farm, that animal is allowed to be exported from Brazil to, let's say, Singapore or Japan or United Arab Emirates or Europe or what. So that's for meat. Vegetables and products that are not from animal origin, they're very known. And then it's just a matter of the plant being approved according to the guidelines of the FDA, and that's fine. Of course, it varies country by country. US is not the only market for confetti, but confetti does not fit into any novel foods or anything that would require a massively complicated regulation. It's just about making sure the food safety guidelines and that the standard certificates are available.
And your Brazilian company, run by your engineering college friend, Menezes, right? Is that, I think, the climate change impact is from a different angle. It is helping farmers growing traditional crops, finding new markets. Is that the impact there?
Exactly. So the impact on that one is more so in the community. It is also the way they grow, because just like everywhere else, potato became in Brazil the number one of this sort of application, like French fries and potato. Potato became so widely consumed in Brazil. But tapioca is such a great ingredient that the originary, like the indigenous population of Brazil would use it as an ingredient since before the Portuguese even came to Brazil. So it's a perfect fit for the land, for the culture. There's a lot of cultural background and history behind it as well. Through history, we have kind of neglected it, and but we still have small farmers and family farmers who are growing it. And it's that kind of product that everyone likes. The consumption is there, but it's not very frequent simply because it's not as present as a French fries, for example. We haven't been constantly reminded of or educated to constantly eat it, right? Unlike rice or beans or potatoes. So the impact on that one, which I found very interesting, is basically getting that ancestral, that historical root from the culture and bringing it in a convenient way to the 21st century, right? I think that's something that has a lot of value. And quite frankly, it's a delicious ingredient as well. There's no reason why, from a taste and texture experience perspective, that this ingredient shouldn't be valued just like a potato should. And then obviously small farmers are the ones growing them. And like nothing wrong with the potato suppliers, but those are massive agribusinesses that are self-sufficient and doing great. But the local farmers and local communities growing tapioca, they do not have such a structure.
I think the interesting point that you're mentioning is about the how it supports local communities. So does it mean more income for these local communities? Maybe they are growing a different crops, so maybe diversified income. There must be an impact there as well, right?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, those are small farmers and, as they have more demand for their products and they are producing tapioca, they can expand and have more income and grow that community. Again, nothing wrong with those, but unlike those massive farms and businesses doing, industrial farming of potato, they're not even close to each other, right? It's a different world. They're not even competing really other than the dish itself on the plate and someone's options. The small farming community growing that business, having demand for their crops is always very helpful. Not to mention that growing different sorts of habits supports, in the end of the day, may impacting less monoculture. And if you have less monoculture, I think it's always good for climate impact, for soil health, for the planet, for protecting biodiversity. It's always helpful.
Absolutely. You said this is grown not very far away from where you stay, which means I'm going to ask you, where in this beautiful country do you stay now, and where these tapioca farmers grow their crop?
Right now I'm only 1 hour away from São Paulo, 1 hour drive. So I'm in a big city called Campinas. And the farms, the factory doing these products right now, the tapioca mandi mais, is in Americana, which is a relatively smaller city nearby Campinas. And the farmers are not far from here, right? Those are all within a 1 hour driving radius from the factory.
When you say smallholder farmers, because the word smallholder farmers, as you know, in Asia and Latin America sounds, it can be two different worlds. They just, how small are these other land holdings? Do they have other crops? Do they have livestock? Just create this picture for us.
That's a great question because in Brazil, when you talk about large farmers, the farms can be as large as Portugal, right? It's not even as large as Singapore, it's
Exactly.
as large as Malaysia. So no, those are smaller, really family farms. They could be anything between 5 to 50 hectares of land. And then, they could be producing only tapioca, but they could be also having their small animals or whatever is it that they grow. Because it's such a small and family-owned business, each one of them will do it in their own way. It's unlike the massive agribusinesses in Brazil, which you know exactly what they're doing. They have soybeans and they may interchange with cotton. And, this is when they get it. This is where they sell it to. That's how they get financing. Everything is structured and standardized to the optimal efficiency. Small farmers are not. Each one of them will do their own thing because they may have a market access. Some of them may be producing eggs, some of them may be producing chicken, some of them may have some cattle. They may interchange cultures, but you don't know. It's one by one.
Fascinating. I'm sure you know this much better than I do, but more potatoes are grown for chips and crisps than they're consumed for curries and fresh potatoes in our food. And there is that emission angle as well. I mean, we generally know that emissions in vegetables is less than emissions for meat, but obviously frozen fries is quite different from a fresh potato curry, right? Is there lower emissions for tapioca chips compared to frozen potato chips? Has there been any studies done?
Being very honest, I do not have data on the emissions specifically on tapioca, for that region versus the potato, whatever it's coming from, because obviously it varies as well. I don't have a trustworthy comparable data on the emissions comparing a potato versus the tapioca. But obviously, as you said correctly, those are ingredients that they are produced locally. They're not a meat, they are in general low emissions. The radius around them in terms of transportation impact is not very high. The process itself is pretty easy. And as far as consuming fresh versus consuming somewhat processed, right? We always have to take into consideration that if we expected people to use fresh potatoes, instead of frozen French fries, pre-fried, easy, convenient, probably we wouldn't have as much consumption simply because there wouldn't be the labor to do that on every single store or every single household, right? It's just, I think that angle of convenience, although it adds on emissions, it also probably, I think the question I would have is that if they were not having that, what would they be having then? And I don't have an answer for that. It might be better, it might be worse, but maybe they would be having chicken nuggets instead of French fries because that would be the only frozen side dish they would have that's easy and convenient. So it's a complex one.
It's a very complex question. And tell us a little bit about Selva. I mean, a new technology, but a ready-made market at this point of time.
What's interesting is because you were mentioning before, briefly touched on how challenging it is for most companies that started on the cell culture space to get their products into market for many different reasons. One of them, obviously, is getting the approval by FDA, but also scaling up and the cost and having the product. Selva realized that and pivoted out of cell-based meat or cell-based fats without, they basically understood that their key value was in their technology of encapsulating, which they were encapsulating cells previously, and then they started encapsulating ingredients. And what's the beauty about encapsulating ingredients? You improve drastically the bioavailability of the ingredients. You improve when do you want a such ingredient to be delivered to the body. You improve taste in certain applications. For example, if you have a formula with DHA and you want to take out that fish smell and taste, obviously if it's the DHA is just sitting there, you're going to have that very unpleasant taste, as it's the case for many products out there. By encapsulating it, you can actually eat it without even tasting it, and it's going to be released in your body in the right stage and format. So you also need less of the ingredient because it's not wasted in the process. So that's very, very powerful. But the most interesting, especially now, in my opinion, is the product that they're calling Coffee Coa, which, as you probably know, when talking about sustainability, it's impossible not to remember about what's going on with cocoa. It is a real crisis right now, and it doesn't seem to be a short-term one. Cocoa is a very problematic chain, and from every single angle you can think of. And right now it has reached a point in which, chocolate producers or confectionaries, they're not even being able to get their cocoa anymore, or the prices are just too high. What Selva has done through its technology was basically extract an element from the coffee husk that it can be mixed to a ratio of up to 70% of the formulation that was supposed to be cocoa. So instead of having 100% cocoa in a given mix, you would have 30% cocoa, 70% of that quantity of coffee coa made of coffee husks, and then would be made into a confectionery, a chocolate or whatever, right? And without any prejudice, and without any negative impact on taste, on anything really. And the process works just as nice. This is fascinating. It's gaining a lot of attention. The products are like, I tasted many different applications and, chocolates and other ways. It's just, you can't even imagine that it's not cocoa there. That's a very fascinating one, which they're using their encapsulating technology to extract that ingredient from the coffee husk, which, by the way, would be otherwise discarded. to have that product substituting cocoa, which is such a,
Absolutely. Big crisis on the cocoa value chain. But also, I haven't traveled in Latin America too much, but Latin America, not so much Brazil, I guess, but Colombia, Peru has a large number of smallholder coffee farmers. So there could be an alternate source of income there as well for coffee farmers.
Yeah, it could be. Well, Brazil is the largest coffee producing country in the world and also very large cocoa producer. So it's a great place for all of that. But it could be, of course, you need to take the coffee husks and do the extraction. And then usually working with larger farms would be probably easier because you got to centralize that production somewhere. But yes, it could be by organizing the supply chain technically could be helpful for smaller farmers to value add on their husks.
Of course, we've talked a lot about the impact. Obviously, congratulations for working with three really different but very interesting companies from different parts of the world as well. And we have to obviously understand where customer traction is coming. And confetti snacks is a consumer-based product. So is Menezes. So, tell us a little bit about how customers are reacting.
And this is one of the reasons I was excited with the idea of helping out Betty in Expo West in February or March, because you get to see real feedback right in front of you, how people would taste and like it or not, right? So consumers absolutely love it when they try. Both Menezes and confetti are products. I mean, food, right? I mean, food. You cannot sell anything in food if it doesn't taste great. That's the number one attribute.
I remember how at Tyndall you worked with chefs.
Absolutely. So at Tindo, we had to overcome the negative perception built by other plant-based products, being not so great in taste. And we recognize that taste is number one again in food. So the same thing goes with confetti and with Menezes. The products, although they do not, it's different nature, they're not working necessarily with chefs in their go-to-market strategy, but the products are incredibly delicious, right? At Tindo, we had a component of actually having to educate people that even chefs who are the highest bar in food would be happy with that novel food. Whereas for confetti and Menezes, they're not considered novel in a way. The ingredients people are familiar with. So in a way, it's less hard. I don't want to say it's easier. It's just less hard because there's less of an education to be made.
So are these companies in the early stage of market acceptance or they have commercial contracts? Just tell us a little bit about where they are.
No, both of them do have commercial contracts and distribution. They are early stage in terms of size, but they are both commercial viable companies selling products, in truckloads or container loads, depending on which you're going to, but being on real shelves in supermarkets and distributors.
And Selva is a business to business company.
Selva is business to business only. It's in a slightly earlier stage, but it has the potential to accelerate maybe even faster than the others, due to its nature. It's addressing a massive market with a very strong pain right now with the cocoa, and being B2B, like one contract may be super significant, right? So that's the state right now. We would expect Selva to start having, those products being commercialized before the end of the year, I guess.
There's been a lot of money thrown at this novel foods business, especially plant-based meat, cellular agriculture, precision fermentation, so on and so forth. But then there's been also a little bit of that, like typical private sector cycles, a little bit of the pulling back. Do these companies require less capital than, they require the same amount of capital as the plant-based companies that you are more familiar with?
It's important to put the macro into perspective, right? Starting a plant-based company now would be drastically different from starting a plant-based company in 2020 at the height of liquidity. If you recall, real interest rates were actually negative. Inflation in the US in early 2022, if you recall, was, getting close to 9-10% a year. And interest rates were something between 0.5 and 2% for a long time. So the real interest rates were negative. And obviously, in that scenario, you have more capital being pushed towards riskier ventures at earlier stage and with long-term potential. The current scenario, which started back in early 2022, again, mid-2022, since the Fed rose interest rates to about 5%, and it stayed since. And inflation came down to, let's call it 3% right now, roughly, right? the scenario is one of less risk appetite. So whichever company is starting now, regardless of the sector, has to be more capital efficient. So back then in 2020, if you were starting a blend-based company, the task would be to be the first on the race, not to be the most capital efficient. And obviously, competitors were throwing huge amount of money to the table. So if you did not raise enough, you wouldn't even have a seat on the table. You would not be able to promote to the deals. You would be simply, not even seen. Currently, the reality is very different. The reality right now is like, how can you build straight away to be as capital efficient as possible, even if it takes longer to build that company? And that's the case for all the founders I'm working with, and that's part of what I advise them to do as well. Like, how can we be more capital efficient? Don't worry about trying to grow extremely fast if that growth is not sustainable. It's how can you make it become a profitable, cash generating business, as soon as possible. Capital for R&D and starting is always necessary. So there is raise, but the raises are drastically smaller when you set yourself to do a capital efficient company from the beginning.
Yeah, there's the capital efficiency angle, which is really the complication that you said, that if you are starting off at a time when liquidity is plenty, then you will have to just be quickly off the race and burn a lot of money and get to the market. But then suddenly investor interest will turn, right? And that has a risk of leaving a lot of companies in the lurch. How 3 years down the line would you help founders manage that? Because things will turn either ways at some point.
You're absolutely right. So, and that's valid for any asset classes, right? I mean, if you are launching a real estate development in a scenario of very low interest rates, you're very likely going to be able to sell everything in advance, even before being constructed, and people will be racing towards it, seeing the prospects of that return coming in. And if you have an interest rate curve climbing during that construction, very likely by the moment the building is close to conclusion or even concluded, you're going to have a lot of people trying to sell out. They're going to try to get liquidity back. They're going to be, maybe the asset price, instead of going up, it went down. And you have restrictions around that, and you have that race for liquidity happening. It's the same in every asset class, whether it's real estate, whether it's private companies or public companies, it's always the same, right? Back then, when the capital was so available, the race and the fight was to get an allocation. So rounds were oversubscribed, capital was plenty, the funds had a mandate to deploy their capital. I mean, their LPs would not just give them the money to be sitting around at no interest rates, right? And then having the best deals and best companies and most promising companies having that. Now the game has shifted to the other end, which is there's a race for liquidity, and then that results in investors having less patience, capital being less patience on the long term. And you ask how I would advise founders being in that space. I think any founder who is minimally reasonable, who has been through this cycle, would sit down and evaluate its own situation, evaluate if it has, if he or she has enough liquidity to take the company to profitability. And if the answer is yes, it's probably going back to those investors and renegotiating. Maybe they get some partial liquidity back. Maybe not all the capital has been used, but maybe in exchange, they could review some of the terms around liquidation preferences or things like that. In a way, find a common ground. But that's really case by case. Some companies do not have the ability to return any capital. Some companies do. Some companies can buy out investors. Some companies can't do much. And, there would be frustration among investors, but that's part of venture capital. If you're investing in venture capital, when they invest in early stage companies as a venture capital, they're expecting to multiply their capital to, potentially by 10, 20 times, 100 times sometimes. But they're also aware there's a 9 out of 10 chance that its capital becomes zero. So that's part of the game. It's part of the venture capital game. And what I would advise founders usually is basically not to ignore those tensions, and basically see if there's a common ground that you can find, that by addressing some of your own needs as a company, but also addressing whatever those of the investors, especially if you've got some cash left or more cash than you need left.
That's about investors. And obviously, we've to end up the podcast with asking about customers. You've handled a large plant-based meat company. You're now working with upcycled vegetable gourmet snacks. You're working with, I'm just talking about the consumer products that you are working with. You're working with Tapioca chips as opposed to frozen chips. These are all niche products. I have two questions actually. How do you segment customers for these types of niche products, and what sort of pricing strategy works?
And that's a great question. And I'll try to give you an answer that's the most generic possible that fits such a different profile, right? But I think I would, in terms of pricing, instead of giving you a number, what I would say is that I would try to understand what sort of occasion that consumer is having your product. If you're having confetti snacks, you're having that confetti snacks, or you want him or he or her to have the snacks instead of what? Is it instead of a Doritos? Is it instead of, cashew nuts? Is it instead of what? What are they actually trading? And what's the price of that other option? That gives a sense of how much they're willing to pay, and the pricing should be around that level for similar quantities. Same thing with Monday buys. It's like, what is it that the product is trying to displace, or in which segment it's trying to enter or serve, right? And sometimes it's an obvious one. Well, instead of having French fries, I want to have this one. Then obviously you got to compare it to French fries. But there is one of their products, for example, that require a bit more of labor. And then what you're substituting or fighting against is not one or another, is you're basically taking out that labor from the kitchen and absorbing that complexity. So what you're selling is basically convenience. And then the way to price it is basically to understand how much that kitchen is saving, and then price it in a way that basically can capture margins by doing it more efficiently on a manufacturing setup.
Understand the product use, understand the substitutes appropriately. But in the case of when I go to the supermarket and look at plant-based meat food, I'm often left wondering, are they targeting meat consumers to switch, or are they consuming in Asia, for example, there's a lot of people who are vegetarians. Are they targeting the vegetarian customers to have a different product? Because then dependence on this, there is segmentation, there's messaging, there's pricing. What do you think people are doing at this point of time, and what do you think people should do?
If you ask me back, and I don't recall, maybe you have, back in 2022, I would give you one answer, and today I would give you an answer that's very different from that one. I have evolved my line of thinking regarding that over time as I experienced the market firsthand. So back then, obviously, it was all about impact and about substituting meat as much as possible. Then obviously following that, we needed a product that would be just as nutritious as meat, that would have a price similar to that of the meat equivalent product, and that would be then eaten by someone who is a meat eater, right? And under that assumption, we would then grow the market to X% of meat. That's where the biggest potential is. And therefore, that's what we should be. This is who we should be talking to. This is who we should be targeting. Everything very logical, like everyone else has always done in this space for so long. But if you ask me today, I would be doing it differently. And the reason I would be doing it differently is because, as logical as everything I told you may sound, consumers are not following a logic when they're buying their food. So the question I would ask consumers would be, do you have a reason to have less meat? Yes or no? If you're a vegetarian, the answer is obvious. And then, targeting you as a vegetarian is about giving you the best possible choice in terms of taste, performance, nutrition, whatever it is that we choose to address. If the answer is no, which is the case for the meat eaters in most of the times, then probably that's not the best market fit. And this is where my answers changes drastically from the past to today. Consumers who eat meat are largely not really looking at reducing their meat consumption, unfortunately. Therefore, this may not be the best market fit. In this case, if we're doing a plant-based meat product, as good as it is, then currently, I would say that targeting groups of people who already have a reason not to eat meat or to really reduce their meat consumption is what I would be doing. And those would include vegans, vegetarians, or people I would not call here the flexitarians, because flexitarian basically, like if you are a restaurant, you put meat on the menu and a plant-based meat, they'll go for meat. But if you take the plant-based meat, they're going to go for meat anyway. So it doesn't really matter. From a restaurant, why would you even put a plant-based meat if that person's going to buy the meat anyway, right? So, or the supermarket shelf is the same thing. Why would you even offer it? So flexitarians, I don't buy into that anymore as a market. But people who really care about reducing, and among those, you have people who committed already at least 1 day a week, 2 days a week, plus vegetarians and vegans, that's who I'll be targeting and talking to.
Wonderful. Andre, it's been lovely speaking to you. And if people want to get in touch with you in your new avatar, how should they?
Yeah, I think, the best way to reach out to me if you don't have my contact will be straight away on LinkedIn. I personally manage my account and I see all the messages and requests. So I think that would be the most appropriate way to reach out to me.
This has been wonderful talking to you. Thank you so much. And I hope we don't talk 3 years later, but maybe a year.
Thank you, Sanjoy. Thank you so much. It's been great talking to you again as well.
Thank you very much.